We're all very passionate about the subject here, but one of the keys to to mastering defense against these techniques is actually to become somewhat dispassionate about them. You have to learn to view what's going on with detachment. The people who do this professionally, I mean, people who are in the professional business of disinformation and propaganda and everything else, they tend to have a very cold view of it. There's no, it's very clinical, very clinical. So you have to adopt a really clinical attitude. And that's actually extremely difficult to do because the people who are trying to attack you are looking for your, what I would call cognitive vulnerabilities. They want to know what are your buttons that they can push. So that's exactly what they're going after. So, and to realize those things about yourself and to try to detect when somebody's trying to push them, that is probably like the hardest thing there is to do. So just keep that in mind. So I want to start out with a quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." Now that sounds like a very current statement. Somebody could have said that yesterday and it would have been true. But the reality is that it was a quote from Thomas Jefferson, of all people, in a letter to John Norval on June 11th in 1807. So you ask yourself, well, gee, how much have things really changed? And the answer is, fundamentally, things haven't really changed very much because people are still people. And these kinds of techniques have always been used on people, go back to the beginning of time, I expect. So what is different, and what you have to keep in mind, is actually the means of delivering these kinds of techniques. So that has changed. So I want you to think about, for example, in the early part of the last century, when radio was introduced, and then when television was introduced, and before that, newspapers, the sources of content creation were very few. They were highly redacted, they were tightly controlled, and the barriers to entry were very, very high, right? It was really expensive to make a radio station, TV station, to run a newspaper, whatever, right? What's changed in the modern information environment and with the coming of social media and the internet in general is that basically anybody can get in and play. Anybody with a phone or a computer and a mobile and a connection, an internet connection, can start pumping out stuff into the environment. So you have a total democratization of what I would call weapons of mass disruption. Anybody can get in and play. And that's different because, first of all, anybody can play. That's a big difference. And second of all, the speed at which information can be disseminated is like unbelievable compared to what it was before, and also the spatial extent. So the change in the speed and the spatial extent, these are new things, and the introduction of those things actually makes qualitative changes into what actually goes on. Think about, an interesting example is think about a modern jet fighter. If you look at a fighter plane from World War I, it was a pretty simple thing, right? A guy was, one guy was flying, maybe the other guy was sitting with a gun trying to shoot at the other guy. So it was pretty simple to control. But if you look at a modern jet fighter, which is extremely sensitive and is filled with hundreds of computers, a human being could not fly a modern jet fighter without all of these computers because the controls are too sensitive. And that's where we've come. So we've gone from the old days where these things were fairly easy to control to now you're like on a modern jet fighter where everything is so sensitive that it's easy to get out of control without help. So just to finish the story with Jefferson, it's kind of interesting to note that Jefferson himself saw the value of these kinds of techniques. So in his campaign against John Adams, he hired a guy who was a sort of a gossip spreader, journalist of the day, a very well-known guy, to spread lies, actual lies about Adams. He said all kinds of things he supported. This guy, he was in favor of, all sorts of terrible things that simply weren't true about Adams. And they were successful, and it worked, and Adams lost the election. And interestingly enough, when the election was over, this guy, Callender was his name, he came to Jefferson. He was prosecuted, and he was put in prison for slander. And when he got out, he came to Jefferson, and he asked for help. And Jefferson said, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So that was a mistake. Because that guy then turned his skill on Jefferson and started spreading all kinds of rumors about Jefferson. So interestingly enough, one of the rumors he spread about Jefferson was that he had children with a black slave. And that caused a big uproar at the time. Oddly enough, it turned out 200 years later, through some kind of genetic analysis and testing, it seems the evidence points to the fact that Thomas Jefferson did in fact have children with black. So it's kind of funny. What was spread as a malicious rumor at the time turned out actually seems to have been the case. But anyway, Jefferson was in on it. Many people throughout history was in on it. Just as this kind of techniques have a long dishonorable history. So just to keep that in mind.